He once said about working in radio that he knew it had potential, but even he couldn't have predicted how fast it would all move. Los Angeles, early 1981. The studio lights were hot. The Soul Train line was smooth, and on the surface, everything looked exactly the way America had been trained to see black music on television. The dancers smiled on cue. The fashion was vibrant but safe. The energy was controlled, polished, familiar. Then Prince walked onto that stage. He wasn't dressed to charm Middle America. He wasn't dressed to explain himself. And he definitely wasn't dressed to ask for anyone's approval. In the seconds it took for him to cross that floor, something in the atmosphere shifted. Some people present later said that Don Cornelius didn't just see a performer walking into his frame. He saw a disruption, a challenge to the image he had spent nearly a decade carefully shaping and defending. What happened after that taping was never announced in a press release, never spelled out in a script, and never addressed to the audience at home. Prince was never officially banned. He simply began to vanish. No dramatic showdown, no on-air statement, no public fallout, just a quiet removal. After that appearance, Prince's presence on Soul Train thinned out to almost nothing, even as he rose into one of the most powerful and controversial black artists the world had ever seen. So what really happened when those cameras stopped rolling? And why did Prince suddenly become too dangerous for black television without anyone ever saying it out loud? Stay with us because this file goes much deeper than music. 1. Two worlds collide. 1979–1981. Before the symbol, before Purple Rain, before the legend hardened into something immovable, there was a more fragile, more volatile moment in Prince's life. A moment when two very different visions of black culture ended up standing face to face, neither willing to step aside. To understand why Soul Train would later treat Prince like an outsider, you have to rewind to 1979 and a contract that quietly rewrote the rules. That year, Prince signed with Warner Bros. Records on terms that, for a young black artist, bordered on unthinkable. He didn't just ask for creative control, he demanded it, and he got it. Not just the right to sing his own songs, not just the right to write them. He took ownership of production, instrumentation arrangements, and his visual identity, every sound, every lyric, every detail of how he appeared. It was a declaration of independence disguised as a record deal, and it immediately set him apart from the machine that had long dictated how black artists were expected to look, sound, and behave. He was 21 years old, but he had already learned a truth many executives quietly feared: whoever controls the work controls the power. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away from the frozen streets of Minneapolis, Soul Train was operating under a completely different kind of logic. By the late 1970, it had evolved beyond a simple dance show. It had become a shield. Don Cornelius had engineered Soul Train to protect black artists from mockery, exploitation, and distortion on mainstream TV. Week after week, the show offered affection instead of anger, romance instead of confrontation, smoothness instead of disorder. It looked like joy, but underneath it was strategy. It was defense. And defense came with rules. Those rules were rarely spoken aloud, but everyone who walked through those studio doors felt them. No explicit sexuality. No gender presentation that might confuse or alarm a conservative audience. No lyrics that would scare sponsors. No images that could be clipped, twisted, and used by hostile media to paint black people as unstable or dangerous. Above all, Soul Train protected what Cornelius privately referred to as a positive black image, an image that reassured America more than it challenged it. Prince did not believe in reassurance. In June 1980, he released Dirty Mind. The album didn't flirt with controversy. It detonated it. From the opening track, he made it clear he wasn't interested in metaphors that played nice with television standards. The lyrics were explicit. The desire was blunt. There were no apologies, no careful edits for radio, no attempt to wrap the content in something respectable enough for family viewing. Songs dealt directly with sex obsession and power in ways black television had never been comfortable showing, especially not in living rooms where parents, church leaders, and advertisers were all watching. Even more unsettling was Prince himself. His image cut straight across expectation, high heels, bikini briefs, lace and androgyny that refused to explain itself. He wouldn't label who he was. He wouldn't reassure anyone about what he was not. For some people, this felt like liberation. For others, it felt like the ground shifting beneath them. Inside TV offices, it felt like a threat. According to people who worked around black music television at the time, executives started quietly tagging Dirty Mind as too graphic, too sexually confrontational for black TV, not because they believed white audiences couldn't handle it, but because black television had spent years fighting to be seen as respectable. Prince's refusal to play along seemed to put that hard-won respectability at risk. He wasn't trying to fit into a televised version of black masculinity. He was dismantling it in real time. For Don Cornelius, that wasn't exciting. It was alarming. At Soul Train, his mission wasn't to tear down existing structures. It was to protect what little space black people had been allowed to occupy on mainstream television. The show reached millions of black homes every weekend. Parents watched with their children. Churches paid attention. Sponsors watched everything. One mistake, one segment spun the wrong way, could be turned into ammunition against the entire platform. In Cornelius's eyes, Prince wasn't just pushing limits. He was pulling the limits off altogether. This wasn't about what Cornelius personally liked or disliked. It was about risk. Prince represented a level of black expression that couldn't be easily defended to advertisers or executives. His sexuality wasn't a wink. It was a stare. His gender expression wasn't framed as a joke. It was serious, curated, and completely unapologetic. He refused to soften himself so that others could stay comfortable, and that refusal came with a cost. By late 1980, this tension stopped being hypothetical. Prince's rise forced Soul Train to confront a question it had managed to avoid for years. What happens when black culture evolves faster than the platform built to shield it? From where Prince stood, the answer was simple: television had to adjust or be left behind. From Cornelius's vantage point, the answer was far more dangerous. If Soul Train wrapped its arms fully around Prince, it risked alienating the families, churches, and sponsors that had legitimized it. If it rejected him too openly, it would look rigid and out of touch with the very future it was supposed to represent. There was no version of this choice that felt clean. On one side stood Prince, insisting on absolute artistic freedom that didn't need to be negotiated, justified, or watered down. He rejected the idea that black artists had to sanitize themselves just to survive. For him, survival came from ownership, not obedience. On the other side stood Soul Train, insisting on absolute control, not as punishment, but as armor. Control over which images reached the screen, which tones were allowed, which performances could be safely framed as positive. Neither vision was entirely wrong, but neither was willing to bend. As Prince's shadow grew longer over the music industry, his relationship with Soul Train grew colder. His name was weighed carefully in meetings, his videos and performances treated as potential hazards instead of opportunities. What had started as curiosity curdled into caution. By the time Prince stepped under those studio lights in the early 1980s, the decision was already taking shape. It did not need to be written down. It did not need to be spoken into a microphone. It was a simple conclusion, understood by everyone who mattered. This artist was powerful. This artist could not be controlled. And that combination was too volatile for a show built on reassurance. The collision was complete. What came next would not involve shouting. There would be no public fallout, no headline-ready scandal. What followed would be quiet, almost invisible. And that quiet would alter Prince's relationship with black television for the rest of his life. Prince before the confrontation, 1968–1978. Long before Prince became a symbol on a t-shirt, a headline, or a question for television executives, he was a child living inside a quiet kind of violence. Not the kind that triggers sirens or newspaper stories, but the kind that slowly rewires a person from the inside and never really lets go. Prince Rogers Nelson was born in 1958 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, far removed from the record label boardrooms and camera-lined stages that would later carry his image. His parents were musicians, which meant sound was everywhere: pianos, rehearsals, late-night arguments about gigs and money. Music filled the air, but it did not guarantee peace. According to those who knew him then, the house was marked by tension clashes and stretches of cold silence. Emotional distance hung over the rooms. Fear appeared in moments that were never fully explained, only felt. As a child, Prince learned early that home was not automatically a place of comfort. It was a place to endure, to navigate carefully, to survive. By his early teens, that instability hardened into something sharper: isolation. Prince was small, reserved, and undeniably different. He didn't fit the expectations of masculinity that surrounded him, and he could feel the eyes on him, even when no one spoke. School did not offer an escape. It became another stage, where he was visible but not understood, present but never fully seen. So he retreated inward. While other kids chased acceptance in hallways and cafeterias, Prince pulled away from people and disappeared into sound. Music became the one place where he wasn't judged for being quiet, intense, or strange. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, as he moved through adolescence, he drifted in and out of different living spaces: friends' houses, basements, spare rooms, couches. Sometimes, according to people close to him, there wasn't a clear place at all. Through all of it, the Minneapolis winters were brutal. The bitter cold outside mirrored the emotional distance he felt from the adults around him. And yet, even in those unstable conditions, he kept moving with a purpose that few recognized. He carried notebooks packed with lyrics, melodies forming in his mind faster than he could get them on paper. He wasn't trying to win popularity contests. He was quietly constructing a world of his own. Prince spent endless hours alone, teaching himself to play instrument after instrument, stacking sounds in his head, building imaginary arrangements, as if he already had a studio no one else could enter. Music stopped being just an outlet. It became structure. It became order. In that private world, he set the rules. He decided the tone, the emotion, the boundaries. No one could interrupt him there. No one could silence him there. This is where a crucial belief took root, that an artist could not survive by asking for permission. In Prince's mind, acceptance from others was fragile, conditional, temporary, easily revoked. Control, on the other hand, felt permanent. If he owned his work, his image, his sound, then no one could take it away from him, no matter who tried to shut the door. By the mid-1970s, that belief moved from the shadows of his private life into everything he touched. He didn't want a producer standing over his shoulder telling him which songs would sell. He didn't want executives redesigning his image into something safer. He didn't want to be explained to the public, corrected by handlers, or polished into a version of himself that made everyone else comfortable. His early life had taught him a brutal lesson: systems protected people who fit neatly into their expectations. Prince understood he would never be one of those people. So he stopped trying. As he edged closer to the music industry at the end of the decade, his worldview was already set in stone. He would not negotiate his identity in exchange for approval. He would not dilute his expression in exchange for safety. And he would not hand control of his art or his body over to institutions that could erase him when it was convenient. What Prince wanted wasn't applause. It was autonomy. That emotional foundation, forged from instability, displacement, and relentless self-reliance, would later collide with a platform built on control, reassurance, and image management. But before that collision showed up in visible ways, booking decisions, edited interviews, vanished appearances, it appeared quietly in a different form. In habits. Prince began to move through professional spaces in ways other people found unnerving, but that he saw as survival. He kept his distance. He chose silence over small talk. He guarded rehearsal spaces as if they were locked rooms inside his mind. He became his own protector. Those behaviors didn't start in television. They started in childhood. and soon they would follow him straight into some of the most polished studios in America. The backstage friction, 1981,982. By the time Prince's world finally overlapped with Soul Train in the early 1980s, the tension wasn't forming. It was already there, baked into every interaction. What unfolded behind the cameras wasn't one explosive confrontation, but a pattern. A pattern that grew sharper, more uncomfortable, and harder to ignore with each visit. According to dancers and production staff who worked at the Soul Train studios during those years, Prince followed a rhythm that clashed completely with the show's tightly controlled machine. Sometimes he arrived far too early, drifting into the building before rehearsals had even officially begun. Other days he showed up at the edge of disaster late enough that people were glancing nervously at the clock. He glided past staff with minimal acknowledgement. No small talk, no reassurance, no attempt to blend into the family-like atmosphere Soul Train tried to project. He didn't make eye contact just to ease tension. He didn't stop to smooth things over. He moved like a man who considered the system around him irrelevant. Unlike most artists, Prince refused to rehearse with the Soul Train dancers. He didn't want the choreography tweaked for television shots. He didn't want his movement adjusted to fit the camera's comfort. For him, rehearsal was a private ritual, not a collaborative exercise. Performance was something he crafted in solitude until the exact moment it needed to appear, and not a second before. Wardrobe became another quiet battlefield. Staff members recalled multiple attempts to negotiate what he wore on stage, suggestions to cover more skin, to reshape certain silhouettes, to tone down what executives perceived as aggressive sexual energy. The requests started soft, almost casual, but the message underneath was clear: make this safer for television. Prince declined every single time. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He didn't storm out or demand his way. What unsettled people most, according to those who saw, was his indifference. He treated the discussions like background noise. He simply wore what he had intended to wear, moved the way he planned to move, and let everyone else live with their discomfort. On stage, the pressure only intensified. Prince didn't hint at sexuality, he occupied it. His performances were intimate and confrontational, not softened with humor or winks to the camera. The movement was charged unapologetically erotic and delivered without the kind of playful reassurance that made sponsors feel safe. For a series watched by parents and children together, built on the image of good, clean fun, this was not just edgy. It was alarming. Backstage, the language began to shift. Whispers passed from dancer to coordinator, from coordinator to producer. Too strange, too sexual, too confusing for the TV audience. These weren't insults shouted in anger. They were quiet labels, assessments, that slowly turned Prince from exciting guest into problem to be managed. He wasn't accused of unprofessional behavior. He was accused of being unmanageable. And in television, that distinction is everything. At the center of this growing unease stood Don Cornelius. Those who worked closely with him during this era describe a man who stayed composed, almost unnervingly calm. He wasn't yelling, throwing things, or issuing ultimatums. He was watching, calculating, heavy with concern. Cornelius believed deeply that order of bodies, of images, of tone was a kind of shield. In his view, black television survived by seeing fear coming and neutralizing it before it made it onto the broadcast. Prince was the opposite of that strategy. He did not neutralize fear. He summoned it. Cornelius watched as Prince ignored eye contact, sidestepped casual conversation, and silently bypassed every attempt to mediate between him and the show's expectations. There were no loud arguments, no walk-offs captured in tabloids, just distance. A widening gulf between what Prince embodied and what Soul Train had been created to contain. One former staffer later claimed that Cornelius would often stand off to the side during Prince's segments, arms folded, saying nothing. Not furious, not laughing, just staring with the look of a man who understood a threat he could not openly name. He knew something others didn't want to face yet. Once an artist proves they don't need the platform loses its grip. Prince never behaved like someone begging to be included. He walked dressed and performed like someone who already knew he could leave at any time. That terrified people whose power depended on artists needing them. As months went by, the friction hardened into avoidance. Prince's name stopped coming up in the same excited way it once had. He was no longer a prized booking. He became a complication. According to people who attended production meetings at the time, his segments began to be framed as liabilities instead of highlights. His image was stamped difficult, not because of on-set meltdowns, but because no one could predict how far he might go or how much control they would have once he was rolling. Opportunities dried up quietly. He wasn't pushed forward for the big moments. He wasn't built into future taping plans the way rising stars usually were. And Prince noticed. He didn't launch a public complaint. He didn't give a volatile interview naming names. He simply pulled back. Behind the scenes, he redirected his energy into albums, into tours, into a fan base that didn't require a television cosign. His audience grew in stadiums, in record stores, in places where no one could cut away to a commercial if things felt too intense. The irony cut deep. The more cultural power Prince gained, the less visible he became on the show that claimed to be the beating heart of black music on television. Not because he wasn't brilliant, but because his brilliance refused to be filtered. This was never just a clash of personalities. It was a philosophical break. Prince stood for an artist whose body image and message were governed by one person himself. No edits. No conditions. No toning it down for anyone's comfort. Soul Train stood for a system that believed black survival on television depended on moderating all of those things. Keeping them contained. Keeping them safe. By 1982, the split was effectively complete. There was no dramatic final episode. No after tonight he will never return speech. Just a shared, silent understanding. Prince would move ahead without Soul Train. Soul Train would continue without Prince. But the emotional cost of that quiet decision on the show, on the industry, and on the idea of what black expression was allowed to look like on television would haunt the culture long after the cameras shut off. Because Prince's absence didn't just leave a gap. It left a warning. The turning point, September 1981. By September 1981, the shift was no longer something you had to sense in the air. It was visible in schedules and conversations, in what wasn't being said out loud. Inside the corridors of black music television, something fundamental had moved, and Prince now stood directly in the cold space that movement left behind. Just a year earlier, Dirty Mind had rattled the industry. Now, with controversy arriving in October 1981, Prince wasn't stepping back from the edge. He was stepping further off it. The music was sharper, the themes more confrontational. Sex, God, identity, surveillance, power, he laid them all out without flinching. There was no retreat. If anything, it felt like a dare. Soul Train did not rise to meet that dare. It began to step away from it. According to multiple people who worked on the show during that time, Prince's name did not disappear in one dramatic sweep. It faded. Not with scandal, but with subtle decisions, each one small enough to ignore on its own, but devastating when strung together. There was never a written directive that said, "Do not book Prince." There was no emergency meeting where his future with the show was debated in front of a room. Instead, the slow removal happened in softer language, in phrases that allowed everyone to pretend nothing irreversible was taking place. First, he was simply mentioned less often. When producers gathered to discuss upcoming seasons and potential guests, Prince's name would be floated almost out of habit and then quietly redirected. "We'll circle back. Maybe not this taping. Let's see where things go." The words were vague by design. No one wanted their fingerprints on a decision they knew might age badly. Then came the programming shifts. Prince stopped being offered the prime spots, no big closing numbers, no centerpiece moments, where the camera lingered and the audience at home was invited to sit with him. When his presence became impossible to ignore, his music might still appear, but earlier in the broadcast, buffered by safer, less controversial acts. His segments tightened. Performance time shrank. Interviews, when they happened, retreated from serious conversations about his art and identity into shallow small talk. Behind the scenes, staff recognized the pattern almost immediately. One former coordinator later described how by late summer, 1981 Prince was rarely discussed as a creative win. Instead, they were told to treat him as a logistical problem. His look was labeled difficult. His performances were framed as unpredictable, not because anyone expected chaos on set, but because they could not guarantee how far he would go, or how they would defend it if he did. Then came the moment that quietly sealed his fate. In mid-September 1981, Prince's name reportedly appeared on an internal Soul Train taping sheet. He was officially listed as a performer. Rehearsal blocks were penciled in. Crew members prepared lighting, sound, and camera setups the way they always did. For a short window it looked like business as usual, and then almost overnight his name was gone. No announcement followed. No internal memo explaining a change of plans. No directive about how to communicate the decision to Prince or his team. Staff members paging through the updated schedule simply noticed a blank space where his name had been. One dancer later recalled turning the page, scanning the lineup, and seeing nothing where he had been listed just days before. It was just gone, she remembered, like it had never been there. Questions were asked quietly. No real answers came. Inside Soul Train's offices, a phrase began to circulate in low, careful tones, never committed to paper. He doesn't fit our image. No one spelled out exactly what that image was supposed to be, but the meaning was not hard to decode. Prince's body was now a problem. Prince's sexuality was now a problem. Prince's refusal to explain himself was now a problem. He did not make people feel safe. He did not play down what disturbed them. He did not sweeten the parts they found threatening. For a show built on reassurance, that was a risk it did not want to carry. What made this turning point even more haunting was Prince's reaction, or his refusal to provide one. He did not storm into press interviews accusing Soul Train of betrayal. He did not publicly attack Don Cornelius. He did not launch a campaign demanding equal treatment. He said nothing. Those close to him would later describe that silence, not as resignation, but as recognition. Prince understood how systems moved. He understood how power worked in rooms where decisions were made but never recorded. He knew what it meant when the invites stopped coming and the explanations never arrived. He knew when a door was being closed without anyone being brave enough to say it out loud. He did not stand in the hallway knocking to be let back in. He did not attempt to prove he was worthy of the platform. He chose a different response, one that was far more dangerous to the system itself. He walked away. According to people in his circle around this time, Prince reached a quiet understanding with himself. If black television was going to filter him, edit him, or erase him, then he would build his career somewhere else. He would pour his energy into stages and screens that did not demand obedience as a condition for visibility. MTV. Relentless touring. Albums that didn't require visual approval. An audience that did not need everything explained or softened. From late 1981 forward, the relationship between Prince and Soul Train effectively ceased to exist. No official end date. No farewell gesture. Just absence. Week after week, viewers tuned in seeing black artists dance, sing, flirt, and perform. But even as Prince's songs dominated radio parties and late-night conversations, he was missing from the one platform that had once claimed to be the pulse of black music on TV. For Don Cornelius, that absence was safer than a visible clash. Those who worked around him during this period describe a man under pressure so intense it didn't need to be shouted to be felt. Sponsors were watching every frame. Churches watched every booking. Parents watched every performance for signs that the show was going too far. Black television had clawed its way into legitimacy, and Cornelius was not willing to lose that position by being painted as reckless or corrupting. In his mind, guarding the show meant guarding its borders, even if that meant quietly closing the door on artists who pushed those borders to the breaking point. Prince didn't just push. He questioned the very structure. He challenged sexual norms. He challenged gender expectations. He pushed against religious certainty. He stared down authority. To make space for Prince as he truly was, Soul Train would have had to stand beside him publicly and defend what it could not fully predict or manage. Cornelius, according to people who knew him, was not prepared to fight that battle on national television. So the choice remained unofficial. No paper trail. No confession. No single moment to point at and say it happened here. Prince was not formally banned. He was avoided. That difference mattered. It meant that years later anyone involved could shrug and say there was no policy, no blacklist, no deliberate act. It kept everyone's hands technically clean, even as the result stayed the same Prince on the outside the show, moving on without him. For Prince, the emotional impact of that erasure ran deeper than any public remark he ever made. This was a man who had grown up feeling unwanted, learning early not to lean on systems that could abandon him. He had built his career around the idea that he would never again be at the mercy of someone else's permission. Being quietly written out of black television didn't break that philosophy. It confirmed it. Systems, he saw again, welcomed difference only as long as they could control it. Prince did not try to prove that he could play by their rules. He made a different choice. He chose complete independence. By the end of 1981, the turning point had come and gone. There would be no dramatic reconciliation arc, no public reckoning, just two paths diverging. Prince no longer bargained with Soul Train, and Soul Train no longer pretended it could contain him. In the silence that followed, something irreversible happened. Prince began to build a legacy so vast, so self-defined, that the platform which had quietly decided he no longer belonged would eventually find itself standing in his shadow, whether it admitted it or not. The explosion without Soul Train, 1982-1984. By 1982, the break was no longer a question. It was a fact, even if nobody ever put it in writing. Prince was no longer orbiting Soul Train. He was moving on his own axis at a speed the show could no longer influence, control, or even fully track. And the way his career unfolded over the next 2 years didn't just vindicate his defiance, it quietly exposed a deeper crack inside black music television. In October 1982, Prince released 1999. The album did not knock politely. It sounded like the future kicking down the door. Synths swallowed nostalgia. The drums felt mechanical and human at the same time. The lyrics fused